There is a clean way to die, and there is a dirty way. A Viking prays to die with a sword in his hand, his blood spilling onto solid earth, his eyes looking up at the open sky as the Valkyries descend. That is the clean death. But the earth has places where the sky cannot reach, places where the ground is not soil and the water is not pure, places where things do not die cleanly, but simply rot, slowly, over thousands of years, trapped in a purgatory of mud and suffocating fog. Jarl Einar was out of choices, and he was out of time. He stood at the edge of the tree line, his chest heaving, his chainmail slick with the blood of his own men. Behind him, echoing through the valley they had just fled, was the sound of horns, Saxon horns. A warband of 300 heavily armored men mounted on warhorses, hunting them down like wounded deer. Einar had 30 warriors left, 30 exhausted, bleeding men and women who had been running for 2 days. "They are less than an hour behind us, Jarl," gasped Halvor, an old veteran missing half his left ear. He leaned heavily on his spear, looking back at the dark forest path. "The horses will run us down before we reach the coast. We do not go to the coast," Einar said. His voice was grim, devoid of the fiery hope that usually inspired his men. He turned away from the pursuing horns and looked at what lay in front of them. The forest abruptly stopped. In its place, a sprawling gray wasteland stretched out as far as the eye could see. It was the Black Mire, an ancient, festering peat bog. There were no trees here, only twisted, dead roots reaching out of the muck, like the skeletal hands of drowning men. The air hung heavy and completely still, choked by a dense, unnatural yellow fog that smelled of sulfur, stagnant water, and ancient decay. The mire? A shield maiden named Runa stepped forward, her eyes wide with a fear that the Saxon army had not been able to provoke. "Almaner, you cannot ask us to walk into the rot. The old songs say the gods do not look upon this place. It is a graveyard for things older than the Aesir. The Saxons will slaughter us in the open field," Einar stated, pointing his blood-stained sword at the swirling yellow fog. "The bog is impassable for horses. The heavy Saxon armor will drag them straight to the bottom. If we go into the mire, they will not follow. It is our only path to life. Life!" Halvor spat on the ground. To be swallowed by the black mud is not life. It is an eternity in the belly of the earth. "Then stay here and die on a Saxon's spear," Einar roared, the desperation finally breaking through his stoic mask. "I am walking into the fog. Who stands with me?" The 30 Vikings looked at the approaching tree line, hearing the hounds of the enemy barking in the distance. Then they looked at the suffocating, silent expanse of the Black Mire. It was a choice between certain death by iron or a gamble with the unknown horrors of the rot. One by one, they gripped their weapons tighter and stepped up beside their Jarl. "May Odin forgive us," Halvor muttered, tightening his leather boots. Einar took the first step. The moment his boot left the solid earth and pressed into the bog, the world changed. The ground was not solid. It was a sponge of decaying moss and black peat. His boot sank instantly to his calf with a sickening, wet-iced sluck. Cold, foul-smelling black water rushed into his boot. "Step where I step," Einar commanded, pulling his leg out of the muck with significant effort. "Do not rush. If you step on a soft patch, the bog will swallow you whole before we can even grab your hand. Use the long shafts of your spears to test the ground." The 30 warriors waded into the wasteland. Within 10 minutes, the solid forest behind them vanished, swallowed completely by the dense yellow fog. The silence of the mire was absolute, oppressive. There were no birds, no insects buzzing. Even the sound of the Saxon horns was muffled, muted by the heavy, damp air until it disappeared entirely. They were isolated in a world of gray and yellow, surrounded by a landscape that looked like a diseased, bruised skin. Every step was an agonizing battle. The black mud was thick, clinging to their legs like wet clay, trying to drag them down. They waded waist-deep through pools of stagnant black water, covered in a thick scum of pale green algae. Bubbles of foul gas constantly rose from the depths, bursting on the surface with a quiet, sickening sound, releasing the stench of rotten eggs and decaying meat. "My head is pounding, Jarl," young Torf complained, rubbing his temples. He was shivering, though the air in the bog was humid and uncomfortably warm. "It is the marsh breath," Halvor warned from behind him, using his spear to probe the dark water ahead. "The gas from the rotting earth. Do not breathe it deeply, boy. It puts visions in a man's head, makes him see things that aren't there." They walked for hours in a single-file line. The exhaustion was setting in, heavier than the chainmail they wore. The fog refused to lift. If anything, it grew thicker, limiting their vision to barely 10 feet in any direction. "Solid ground!" Einar suddenly called out, his voice a hoarse rasp. Ahead of them, rising slightly out of the black water, was a small island of relatively dry peat and pale, dead grass. They scrambled onto the island, collapsing onto the damp ground, chests heaving, their legs painted pitch black with the foul mud of the mire. "We rest here," Einar panted, driving his sword into the peat. "Drink your water, but sparingly. Do not, under any circumstances, drink the water of the bog. It is poison." Runa sat near the edge of the small island, staring blankly into the swirling yellow fog. She reached down to wash the thick black mud from her hands in a shallow puddle. As the mud washed away, her fingers brushed against something submerged in the peat just below the water's surface. It felt smooth, like wet leather. Runa frowned. She pushed the murky water aside with her hands, digging her fingers slightly into the soft black earth to see what she had touched. "Howl." Runa's voice was a barely audible whisper. Einar looked up from his water skin. "What is it, Runa?" She didn't answer. She was staring into the shallow puddle, completely paralyzed. Einar stood up, drawing his sword instinctively, and walked over to her. He looked down into the water, staring back up at them. Just 3 inches beneath the surface of the black peat was a face. It was a human face, but it was horrifyingly wrong. The skin was not rotting, it was perfectly preserved, tanned to a dark, leathery brown by the acidic water of the bog. The lips were drawn back in a permanent, silent scream, revealing perfectly white teeth that contrasted sharply with the dark, leathery skin. The hair, a faded shade of red, floated gently in the murky water like bloody seaweed. But the most disturbing detail was the thick, braided leather rope wrapped tightly around the corpse's neck, biting deep into the preserved flesh. "A bald body," Halvor said, walking up beside them. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded deeply, profoundly sad. He made the sign of the hammer over his chest. "A sacrifice from the old days." "Who did this?" young Torth asked, his voice trembling as he looked at the strangled corpse. "The people who lived here before our grandfathers," Halvor explained quietly. "When the winters were too long, or the crops failed, they would bring a victim to the black mire. They would strangle them, slit their throats, or drown them in the black mud to appease the gods of the earth. The bog does not eat them, it keeps them forever." "Do not touch it," Einar ordered, pulling Runa back from the water's edge. "Leave the dead to the dark." "Jarl." Runa pointed a shaking finger out into the fog, away from the island. "Look." Einar squinted through the yellow mist. The small island they were resting on was surrounded by shallow pools of stagnant water, and in those pools, barely visible beneath the scum and algae, were shapes, scores of them. Einar walked to the other edge of the island. Just beneath the surface lay a man with his chest caved in. 10 feet away, a young woman with her hands bound behind her back with willow branches. Further out, a child, perfectly preserved, curled into a fetal position in the black peat. They hadn't just stumbled upon a single grave. They were resting in the center of a massive, ancient, sacrificial burial ground. There were hundreds, perhaps thousands of perfectly preserved, leathery corpses floating just inches beneath the surface of the mire in every direction. "We are surrounded by the dead," Torf whimpered, backing away toward the center of the small island. "They are just meat," Enner snapped, trying to project a confidence he did not feel. "They have been dead for 1,000 years. They cannot hurt you. The Saxons can." We rest for 10 more minutes, then we keep moving. But rest was impossible. The suffocating fog, the smell of sulfur, and the hundreds of screaming, leathery faces staring up at them from the water created an atmosphere of pure, psychological terror. The marsh breath, the foul gas rising from the bog, was growing thicker. It tasted sweet and metallic on the tongue, causing a slight dizziness that made the edges of their vision blur. Einar sat on a dead log, rubbing his eyes. He felt a strange lethargy creeping into his bones, a heavy, irresistible urge to simply lie down in the soft, wet moss and sleep. "Einar?" He snapped his head up. The whisper was softer than the rustle of dry grass. It sounded like it came from directly behind his left ear. He drew his sword and spun around. There was no one there, only Halvor sitting 10 feet away, sharpening his spear. "Did you hear that?" Einar asked, his grip tightening on his hilt. "Hear what, Jar?" Halvor asked, looking up. A voice, a whisper. Halvor's weathered face grew pale. He looked around the fog-choked island. "I told you, Einar. The marsh breath. It plays tricks. Do not listen to the fog." But it wasn't just Einar. On the other side of the island, a warrior named Corey suddenly stood up. His eyes were glazed over, staring blankly into the dense yellow mist. "Mother," Corey whispered, taking a step toward the edge of the water. "Corey, sit down," Einar commanded, walking toward the man. "She's out there," Corey said, a wide, unnatural smile spreading across his face. He pointed into the deep bog. "She says the water is warm. She wants to wash my face." "Your mother died 10 winters ago, Corey," Halvor yelled, standing up. "It is the gas. Do not step off the island." But Corey wasn't listening. He dropped his sword. It fell into the mud with a dull thud. He took another step, right to the edge of the black water, where the leathery face of the strangled sacrifice stared up at him. "I'm coming," Corey whispered. Before Einar could reach him, Corey stepped off the island. He didn't step into shallow water. The edge of the island was a sheer drop-off into a bottomless pit of liquid peat. Corey sank instantly, the black muck swallowing him up to his chest in a single second. "Corey!" Einar lunged forward, grabbing the man's thick leather belt. Alfr and Runa rushed to help, grabbing Einar and pulling him backward. But Corey wasn't fighting to get out. He was fighting to go deeper. He reached his hands down into the black water, pulling himself downward. "Let me go, Jarl," Corey said, his voice terrifyingly calm, even as the foul mud rose to his chin. "They are singing. The chorus is so beautiful down here." "Pull him up," Einar roared, his muscles straining against the suction of the bog. They heaved with all their might. Slowly, agonizingly, they began to drag Corey out of the muck. His chest cleared the water, but the bog did not want to let go. As they pulled Corey upward, the black water around his waist churned violently. Something broke the surface. It was an arm. It wasn't Corey's arm. It was dark, leathery brown, thin as a skeleton, covered in dripping black slime. The fingernails were yellow and cracked. The arm wrapped tightly around Corey's waist. Then a second arm broke the surface, grabbing Corey by the throat. Einar stared in absolute, paralyzing horror. Looking down into the churning black water, he saw the face of the strangled bald body. It was no longer staring blankly at the sky. Its dark, leathery head had turned. Its perfectly preserved, dead white eyes were looking directly up at Einar, and the dead thing smiled. With a force that defied physics, the leathery arms jerked backward. The thick leather belt Einar was holding snapped like a dry twig. Corey was violently yanked down into the black abyss. The surface of the bog smoothed over instantly, bubbling softly, releasing a puff of sulphurous yellow gas. Corey was gone. Einar fell backward onto the island, the broken piece of the belt still clutched in his hand. He stared at the spot where his warrior had vanished. The 30 Vikings stood in absolute horrified silence. Then, all around the island, the shallow pools of water began to bubble. Schlick, schlick, the sound of wet leather moving in mud. Underneath the surface, the hundreds of dark, preserved faces were all turning their heads. They were all looking at the island, and in the heavy yellow fog, a chorus of thousands of whispering voices began to sing. The singing did not come from throats of flesh and bone. It was a resonant, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate directly from the black mud itself, a chorus of thousands of victims trapped in the peat, their lungs filled with the dark water for a millennia. It was a lullaby of absolute despair, carried on the suffocating yellow marsh breath. Jarl Einar stood frozen on the edge of the small island, staring at the violently bubbling water where Corey had just been dragged under. The broken piece of leather belt hung uselessly in his hand. Schlick, scoop. The sound of wet, heavy suction broke his paralysis. All round the perimeter of the small, dry patch of peat, the dark water was churning. The shallow pools that dotted the wasteland were no longer still. Sheared wall, Einar roared, his voice cutting through the hypnotic, humming trance of the yellow fog. He drew his heavy broadsword, the steel hissing as it left the scabbard. Back to back, form the ring, now! The 28 remaining warriors snapped out of their stupor. Decades of ingrained battle discipline overrode the primal terror of the supernatural. They scrambled to the center of the small island, locking their round wooden shields together, facing outward toward the bubbling black water. From the muck, the ancient dead began to rise. They did not burst from the water like angry demons. They rose slowly, agonizingly, as if the thick peat was reluctant to let them go. Directly in front of Einar, the leathery, perfectly preserved face of the strangled man broke the surface. The thick leather cord was still wrapped tightly around its neck, biting deep into the dark brown flesh. The corpse placed 2 skeletal, elongated hands on the edge of the dry peat. Its skin was the color and texture of old, wet leather, tanned and hardened by the acidic bog water over thousands of years. It pulled itself up. The black mud sloughed off its emaciated body in thick, foul-smelling globs. It had no eyes, only empty, milky white spheres that stared blindly into the fog. Odin's blood, Halvor whispered, his spear shaking in his grip. They are not rotting. They are preserved. Around the island, dozens more were dragging themselves out of the shallows. Men, women, and even children. Some had their throats slit, their heads lolling unnaturally on severed necks. Others had their limbs bound with ancient willow branches, hopping and writhing like grotesque worms. They did not carry weapons. They did not roar or scream. The only sound they made was the wet, slapping noise of their bare, leathery feet on the damp earth and that endless, maddening humming. "Spears out," Einar commanded. "Do not let them close the distance. Frost and retreat." The first wave of the Bog Bodies reached the shield wall. They moved with a sluggish, jerky motion, but what they lacked in speed, they made up for with an unstoppable, unnatural momentum. Halvor thrust his heavy, iron-tipped spear directly into the chest of the strangled man. The spearhead hit the corpse's sternum with a dull thump. It did not pierce. The tanned, leathery skin of the bog body was incredibly tough, hardened into a natural armor by centuries of chemical preservation. Halvor grunted, putting his entire weight behind the thrust, finally driving the iron tip through the tough hide and deep into the creature's chest. "I have him," Halvor yelled, but the strangled man did not stop. It didn't even flinch. It simply kept walking forward, forcing the spear shaft deeper into its own body, sliding up the wood until its dark, leathery hands slammed into Halvor's wooden shield. "It feels no pain." Halvor panicked, trying to pull his spear back, but the thick, rubbery flesh of the corpse clamped down on the wooden shaft, trapping the weapon. "Swords, hack them apart!" Einar bellowed, stepping forward to cover Halvor. Einar swung his broadsword in a massive, sweeping arc, aiming for the strangled man's neck. The heavy steel blade bit deep, but it didn't cleave cleanly through as it would with living flesh. It felt like hacking into a thick, wet tree trunk. The blade stuck halfway through the neck, grinding against the preserved cervical vertebrae. The strangled man's head flopped to the side, hanging by a thick flap of leathery skin, but its hands kept pushing, fingers scrabbling violently over the top of Einar's shield, trying to reach his face. The grip was terrifyingly strong, the frantic, desperate strength of a drowning man. Einar kicked the creature in the chest, wrenching his sword free. The headless body staggered backward, tumbling back into the black water with a heavy splash. But 3 more were already stepping up to take its place. The small island descended into a chaotic, desperate melee. The Vikings hacked and slashed, but the Bog Bodies were relentless. They didn't attack to kill, they attacked to grab. They wanted to pull the living down into the black mud to share the eternal suffocating dark. "They're too tough," Runa shrieked, driving her short sword into the stomach of a female bog body. No blood poured out, only a thick, foul-smelling black ooze that smelled of ancient peat. The female corpse grabbed Runa's wrist with both hands, its grip like an iron vise. Runa screamed, dropping her shield as she was dragged forward, her boots slipping on the wet mud. The female corpse was pulling her toward the edge of the water. "Runa, hold on!" Torf yelled, swinging his axe downward, severing the corpse's arms at the elbows. The female body fell back, but the severed leathery hands remained clamped around Runa's wrist, the fingers still twitching and digging into her skin. Runa frantically beat the dead hands against her knee until they finally loosened and dropped to the earth like giant dead spiders. "Jarl, we cannot hold them!" Halvor shouted over the sound of hacking steel and splashing water. "There are too many!" "They are rising from the deep water now." Einar looked out into the yellow fog. Halvor was right. The surface of the vast black mire was boiling. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of shapes were slowly wading through the waist-deep muck, converging on their tiny island from all sides. But the physical assault was only half the battle. The marsh breath, the heavy yellow gas rising from the disturbed peat, was thickening. The violent movement of the fight was stirring up massive pockets of toxic, hallucinogenic sulfur trapped beneath the surface. The air turned a sickly, bruised green. Einar felt a sudden, sharp pain behind his eyes. The sounds of the battle around him became muffled, as if he were underwater. His limbs felt incredibly heavy, and a strange, euphoric warmth began to spread through his chest. He blinked rapidly, trying to clear his vision. When he opened his eyes, the bog body standing in front of him was no longer a leathery, strangled corpse. It was his brother Leif. Leif had died in Einar's arms 15 years ago, a Saxon spear in his gut. But here he was, standing in the yellow fog, looking young, vibrant, and perfectly healthy. Leif smiled, reaching his hand out toward Einar. "It's over, Einar." Leif's voice echoed in Einar's mind, sweet and comforting. "You don't have to fight anymore. The war is done. Come rest. The ground is so soft here." Einar's sword arm dropped. The euphoric gas was overriding his survival instinct, flooding his brain with a desperate desire to surrender. He took a step toward his dead brother. "Brother," Einar whispered, reaching out to take Leif's hand. Scrack! Heavy wooden shield slammed into Einar's side, knocking him hard to the ground. "Wake up, Jarl!" Halvor screamed, standing over him, wildly jabbing his spear at the advancing horde. Einar shook his head violently. The vision of his brother shattered, replaced by the horrifying reality of a towering, mud-caked bog body reaching down to wrap its skeletal fingers around his throat. Einar rolled sideways, driving his sword upward, hamstringing the corpse and sending it crashing face first into the mud. He scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily through his mouth, trying not to inhale the deep yellow fog. The gas was a weapon far deadlier than the leathery skin of the dead. It was turning his men against themselves. To his right, a veteran warrior named Ketil had completely dropped his shield. Ketil was laughing a high-pitched, hysterical sound that chilled Einar to the bone. "Look at the gold!" Ketil screamed, pointing into the deep, black water where dozens of corpses were wading toward them. "Do you see it? The king's hoard! It's right under the water! We are rich! Ketil, step back!" Runa yelled, but Ketil ignored her. Driven mad by the toxic marsh breath, he saw unimaginable wealth instead of ancient death. He laughed again and dove headfirst into the deep, bubbling peat. He didn't resurface. The black mud swallowed his laughter instantly. The bog bodies in the water swarmed to the spot where he had dived, their arms pushing him down deeper into the anaerobic dark. 26 left. "The gas is breaking their minds," Halvor yelled, coughing violently. "If we stay here, we will all go mad. Then we leave the island." Einar roared. He looked frantically into the dense fog, searching for any landmark, any higher ground. But there was nothing but gray wasteland and swirling yellow mist. "Where do we go, Jarl?" Runa cried. "If we step off the island, we sink." "We wade," Einar commanded, wiping the toxic sweat from his eyes. "We form a wedge. We push through the shallowest parts. Do not stop moving. If you stand still, you sink. If you breathe deeply, you go mad." He pointed his sword straight into the thickest part of the fog, away from the distant sounds of the Saxon horns. "Form the wedge! I take the point!" "Move!" The Vikings broke the defensive circle. With Einar at the apex, they charged off the small island and back into the black, freezing water of the mire. The shock of the cold water snapped some of them out of their hallucinogenic stupor, but the physical reality of what they were doing was a nightmare of its own. They waded waist-deep through the thick, viscous peat. Every step required monumental effort, pulling against the suction of the mud. And they were not alone in the water. The bog bodies were everywhere. As the Vikings pushed through the muck, they constantly bumped into the submerged, leathery corpses floating just beneath the surface. It was a gauntlet of pure horror. "Keep your shields angled down," Einar yelled, hacking at a pair of dark hands that broke the surface, grabbing blindly at his belt. Wading through the mire felt like walking through a forest of underwater vines, but the vines were human arms. Hands grabbed at their ankles, wrapping around their boots with terrifying strength. Fingers dug into the chainmail on their calves. A young warrior named Sven tripped over a submerged log. Before he could regain his balance, the water around him boiled. 5 bog bodies, hidden just beneath the algae, lunged upward. They didn't strike him. They simply piled on top of him, using their heavy, waterlogged weight to press him down into the mud. Sven's scream was cut short by the thick, black water. Einar tried to turn back, but the mud was too thick and the press of bodies too dense. "Keep moving," Halvor roared, shoving the warrior next to him forward. "Do not stop for the fallen." 25 left. The wedge formation pushed deeper into the fog, leaving a trail of churning black water and floating, severed limbs behind them. The physical exhaustion was overwhelming. Their lungs burned, their muscles screamed, and the toxic, yellow gas continued to whisper promises of rest in their ears. "My legs are numb," Runa gasped, marching right behind Einar. She was swinging her sword blindly into the water, hacking at anything that moved. "Einar, I cannot feel the bottom anymore." Einar stopped. The water had risen to his chest. The thick black mud beneath his boots was giving way to an unfathomable depth of liquid peat. "Hold, Einar ordered. The wedge halted, struggling to tread water in the thick muck. The bog bodies were closing in behind them, a slow, relentless wave of leathery flesh and dead white eyes. "We are walking into a deep sinkhole," Halvor warned, testing the water ahead with his spear. "The shaft doesn't touch the bottom. If we take 5 more steps, we drown. We can't go back." Runa panicked, looking over her shoulder at the approaching horde. The slow slap of the corpses wading through the water sounded like the ticking of a doomsday clock. Einar closed his eyes for a second, fighting the dizziness of the marsh breath. He tried to listen through the fog. Over here, a whisper. But this one didn't sound like his brother. It sounded like the wind rustling through dry branches. He opened his eyes and looked slightly to his left. The yellow fog seemed to thin just a fraction in that direction. And looming in the mist, rising out of the black water like the skeleton of a giant, was a colossal, ancient oak tree. It was utterly dead. Its bark was stripped white, its massive branches twisted and gnarled, reaching toward the hidden sky like screaming fingers. The roots of the tree were enormous, forming a thick, tangled platform that rose several feet above the surface of the black water. "There," Einar pointed with his sword. "The dead tree, the roots are out of the water. Make for the tree." They changed direction, fighting frantically against the deep water. The bog bodies were only 20 feet behind them now, an army of the drowned humming their terrible vibrating lullaby. Einar reached the edge of the massive root system. The wood was slick with black slime and pale moss, but it was solid. He hauled himself up onto the thickest root, his chest heaving, his chainmail dripping with foul mud. He turned back and reached his hand out. "Come on, pull yourselves up." He grabbed Runa's hand and hauled her onto the roots. Halvor scrambled up next, using his spear as a vaulting pole. The remaining Vikings climbed desperately onto the massive tangled platform of wood, pulling each other up just as the first wave of bog bodies reached the tree. The corpses slammed into the thick roots, their leathery hands scrabbling uselessly against the slick wood. They couldn't climb. They were creatures of the mud. Their joints were too stiff, their movements too sluggish to pull themselves out of the water. The 24 surviving Vikings collapsed onto the twisted roots, panting, shivering, and staring down in horror at the black water below them. The tree was surrounded, hundreds of bog bodies pressed against the roots, staring up with blind white eyes, reaching their dark skeletal hands toward the Vikings. The humming was deafening here, vibrating through the ancient wood of the tree. "We are safe," Torf sobbed, lying on his back, staring up into the yellow fog. "They cannot climb. We are safe." "For how long?" Halvor asked grimly, wiping the black mud from his face. "We are trapped on a piece of dead wood in the middle of a poisoned sea. We have no food. We cannot drink the water. And the gas? The gas is thicker here." Einar leaned back against the massive, pale trunk of the dead oak tree. Halvor was right. The yellow fog was incredibly dense around the tree, swirling thickly among the dead branches. The air smelled intensely of sulfur and sickly sweet rot. Einar felt the bark of the tree against his back. It felt strangely soft. He turned his head and looked at the massive trunk. The bark was not wood. Einar's heart stopped. He pushed himself away from the trunk, scrambling backward on his hands and knees. "Jarl, what is it?" Runa asked, seeing the sheer, unadulterated terror on Einar's face. Einar couldn't speak. He just pointed a trembling finger at the trunk of the dead tree. The others looked. The pale white bark of the giant oak tree was not wood. It was flesh. It was hundreds of human bodies, bog bodies, fused together, pressed and molded into the shape of a colossal tree trunk. Their leathery arms and legs formed the twisted branches. Their screaming faces were embedded in the surface, mouths stretched wide in silent agony. The moss hanging from the branches was human hair, matted with ancient black mud. It wasn't a tree, it was a monument of flesh. a throne built from 1,000 sacrifices. And as the Vikings stared in absolute paralyzing horror, the yellow fog at the base of the flesh tree began to part. A figure stepped out from a hollow opening in the center of the twisted trunk. It was not a bog body, it was not a leathery corpse, it was a woman. She was unnaturally tall, clad in a tattered ancient gown that seemed woven from the black moss itself. Her skin was not tanned or preserved, it was pale, flawless, and glowing with a sickly, luminescent white light. Her eyes were solid black, pools of infinite dark water. Long, wet black hair clung to her face, dripping foul mud onto the roots. She did not look like a rotting corpse. She looked like a goddess of the rot, the mother of the mire. The humming of the hundreds of bog bodies around the roots suddenly stopped. Absolute silence fell over the wasteland. The pale woman looked up at the 24 terrified Vikings huddled on her roots. She smiled, a smile that promised an eternity of suffocation. "Welcome, little warriors," her voice echoed, not in their ears but directly inside their minds, sweet and metallic, like the poisonous gas. "The harvest is early this year, but the earth is always hungry." From the hollow opening behind her, massive, thick black vines, or perhaps tentacles made of pure, living peat, began to slither out, tasting the air, reaching up toward the trapped Vikings. The true horror of the black mire had finally awakened. The pale woman did not walk. She glided over the twisted, fleshy roots of the colossal tree, her bare feet leaving no trace on the slick black mud. She was a vision of terrifying, impossible beauty in the heart of absolute rot. The thick yellow marsh breath swirled around her like a living cloak, pulsing with a faint, sickly phosphorescence. And from the hollow cavity of the flesh tree behind her, the true nightmare emerged. They looked like thick, black vines, but they moved with the muscular, undulating grace of serpents. They were made of living, compressed peat, woven with the preserved hair and bone fragments of 1,000 ancient sacrifices. They slithered out of the dark hollow, tasting the damp air, reaching toward the 24 terrified Vikings huddled on the root platform. "Form the line!" Einar roared, his voice cracking against the dense, heavy air. "Do not let them touch you!" Dropped the vines. A massive peat tentacle, thick as a ship's mast, whipped forward with blinding speed. It bypassed the shield wall entirely, striking a veteran warrior named Ulf in the chest. The impact sounded like a heavy club hitting a wet sack of grain. Ulf was lifted off his feet, the black vine wrapping instantly around his waist and crushing his ribs with a sickening crack. "Jarl!" Ulf screamed, blood spraying from his lips as he was dragged backward across the slippery roots toward the hollow of the flesh tree. Halvor lunged forward, bringing his heavy iron spear down like a chopping axe. The blade severed the thick black vine. Ulf dropped to the roots, gasping for air. But the victory lasted only a fraction of a second. The severed end of the vine did not bleed. It simply dissolved into loose black mud, while a new, sharper tendril instantly formed from the stump, shooting forward to grab Ulf by the ankle. "They regenerate!" Halvor yelled, retreating as 3 more vines snapped at his spear. "It is just mud and magic, Einar. We cannot kill the dirt." "Then we kill the witch." Einar pointed his broadsword at the glowing pale woman standing effortlessly amidst the chaos. Einar charged over the slick, fleshy roots, dodging a whipping vine, raising his heavy sword to cleave the mother of the mire in two. He swung with all the fury of a desperate jarl. The steel blade sliced cleanly through her neck, but there was no resistance, no bone, no meat. Einar's sword passed through her pale throat as if cutting through thick smoke. The woman's head did not fall. She simply tilted it, her solid black eyes locking onto Einar's. She wasn't fully physical. She was a projection of the toxic gas, a localized manifestation of the bog's ancient, malevolent consciousness. She smiled, a serene, terrifying expression, and gently placed her pale, glowing hand on Einar's chest, right over his heart. The cold was absolute. It wasn't the freezing chill of the winter mountains. It was the damp, stagnant cold of a deep, forgotten grave. Such a heavy burden, Jarl Einar. Her voice echoed entirely within his mind, a chorus of 1,000 drowned women whispering in unison. So many men led to the slaughter, so much blood on your hands. Why carry the shield when the mud is so soft? Einar staggered backward, his vision swimming. The yellow fog thickened around him, turning a bright, toxic green. The sounds of the battle, the screaming of his men, the wet slapping of the vines faded into a dull, underwater hum. The marsh breath was overriding his senses completely. He didn't see the twisted, horrifying flesh tree anymore. He saw the great hall of his childhood. He saw a massive, roaring fire in the hearth. He saw his father sitting in the high seat, raising a horn of mead. "Come, my son," his father's voice echoed in the green fog. "You have fought enough. Take off your armor. Sit by the fire. Sleep." Einar's grip on his broadsword loosened. The heavy weapon slipped from his fingers, clattering uselessly against the roots. He felt an overwhelming euphoric exhaustion. He reached up with trembling hands and began to unbuckle the heavy leather straps of his chainmail. "Jarl Einar, now!" A violent shove sent Einar crashing to the hard wood. The illusion shattered like thin ice. The great hall vanished, replaced by the suffocating yellow fog and the towering, screaming faces of the flesh tree. Runa stood over him, her face smeared with black mud and blood, holding her shield defensively over his fallen body. "Do not listen to her, Einar," Runa screamed, swatting away a thick peat vine that tried to wrap around her leg. "It is the poison. Breathe through your teeth." "Focus on the pain," Einar gasped, shaking his head violently. The euphoric warmth is replaced by a crushing headache, but his mind was his own again. He grabbed his sword from the roots and scrambled to his feet. The battle on the root platform was a slaughter. They could not fight the mother and they could not cut the regenerating vines. But the true devastation was psychological. The toxic gas was breaking the Vikings faster than the physical attacks. Young Torf stood near the edge of the platform. He had dropped his axe. He was staring directly at the hollow of the flesh tree, tears streaming down his dirt-caked face. "I hear them," Torf whispered, stepping forward. "The Valkyries. They are singing for me. The golden gates are open." "Torf!" "Stay back!" Halvor yelled, trying to reach the boy. But a massive vine blocked his path, forcing the old veteran to defend himself. Torf walked with a serene, peaceful smile directly toward the mother of the mire. The pale woman stepped aside, gesturing gracefully into the pitch-black hollow of the tree. Torf stepped inside. He didn't disappear into the dark. The moment he crossed the threshold, the pale, fleshy bark of the tree writhed. Torf screamed, a sudden piercing shriek of absolute agonizing reality as the illusion broke. But it was too late. The living wood absorbed him. His body was pulled into the trunk. Einar watched in paralyzed horror as Torf's face pushed outward through the bark, joining the hundreds of other screaming, leathery faces permanently embedded in the monument of flesh. The boy was flash-preserved, alive, trapped in an eternal silent scream. 23 left. "We cannot win this," Runa cried, backing up until she was standing on the very edge of the root platform. Below her, the black water churned, filled with hundreds of bog bodies waiting patiently for them to fall. "We are trapped between the dead and the witch." Einar looked desperately around the fog-choked platform. 5 more of his warriors were on their knees, staring blankly into the mist, succumbing to the hallucinations. The vines were slowly wrapping around their waists, dragging them unresisting toward the hollow. Einar's mind raced. "Think like a jarl. Think like a killer. If you cannot kill the dirt, and you cannot cut the ghost, what destroys the earth?" He remembered Halvor's words from the edge of the bog, the gas from the rotting earth. Einar had seen marsh lights before, will-o'-the-wisps, blue and green flames that danced over the bogs at night, burning without wood, feeding entirely on the invisible, foul-smelling breath of the rot. The yellow fog around the tree was incredibly dense. The smell of sulfur and methane was overpowering. "Halvor!" Einar roared over the cacophony of the struggle. "The marsh breath, does it burn?" Halvor parried a vine, looking back at Einar with wide, terrified eyes. "It is the breath of the deep earth, Einar. It is highly flammable. If you strike a spark here, we will all be incinerated. Better to burn in the light than rot in the dark," Einar bellowed. He sheathed his sword and ripped the heavy leather pouch from his belt. "Listen to me," Einar screamed to his remaining conscious warriors. "Get to the edge of the roots. Hold your breath. When I give the word, you jump into the water. Jump into the water," Runa yelled in disbelief. "The bodies will pull us down. The fire will burn the air above. Jump or burn." "Flint's out." Einar didn't wait for them to argue. He pulled a thick piece of flint and a crescent-shaped steel striker from his pouch. He charged directly toward the mother of the Mire. The pale woman smiled, raising her hand, sending 3 massive thick peat vines directly at his chest. Einar didn't try to dodge. He dove forward, sliding on his knees across the slick, fleshy roots, sliding directly under the massive vines, aiming straight for the hollow opening of the flesh tree. The concentration of the yellow sulfurous gas was thickest here, pouring out of the hollow like smoke from a chimney. The mother of the Mire looked down at him, her solid black eyes showing a flicker of confusion. She was a creature of water, mud, and slow decay. She did not understand the sudden volatile violence of fire. Einar raised the flint and steel. He was inches away from the hollow. "To Valhalla!" Einar roared. He struck the steel against the flint with every ounce of strength he possessed. A shower of bright, hot orange sparks erupted into the dense, swirling yellow fog. For a fraction of a millisecond, the air seemed to hold its breath. Then the world turned blue. It wasn't a slow, creeping fire. It was a massive, concussive, volumetric explosion. The dense pocket of methane and sulfur gas surrounding the flesh tree ignited instantly. A blinding flash of blue and orange plasma expanded outward with the force of a thunderclap. The shockwave hit Einar like a physical wall of heat, throwing him backward off the roots, launching him 20 feet through the air. As he flew backward, he saw the mother of the Mire. The pale, glowing apparition did not burn like flesh. The intense heat of the flash fire instantly vaporized the moisture that sustained her projection. She let out a shriek that sounded like tearing metal, her form flickering wildly before collapsing into a shower of boiling black mud. But the true devastation was the tree itself. The flesh tree was composed of thousands of highly preserved, leathery corpses. Over centuries, the acidic bog water had tanned their skin, but it had also preserved their body fat, turning them into massive, highly flammable candles of human wax. The flash fire ignited the tree. Flames 80 feet high roared into the yellow sky. The ancient screaming faces embedded in the bark melted and bubbled, releasing a stench of burning hair and rendered fat so foul it defied description. The massive root structure, weakened by the fire and the concussive force of the gas explosion, began to groan and splinter. "Jump!" Halvor's voice echoed somewhere in the chaos. Einar hit the black water of the mire with a massive splash. The heat above the surface was unbearable, searing his face and singing his hair. The sky above the bog was a raging inferno, burning away the toxic yellow fog, illuminating the gray wasteland in a horrific, dancing orange light. Einar sank below the surface, the freezing black water a sudden, shocking relief from the fire. But he was not alone in the water. The explosion had not killed the bog bodies waiting in the shallows. It had only agitated them. As Einar struggled to tread water, trying to keep his head above the surface without breathing in the burning air, cold, leathery hands grabbed his boots. Dozens of them, the body swarmed him, They didn't bite or scratch. They simply grabbed, adding their heavy, waterlogged weight to his body. Einar! He heard Runa scream from somewhere nearby, but he couldn't see her through the thick smoke and churning black water. A heavy, preserved hand wrapped around Einar's throat. Another grabbed his belt. Two more clamped onto his shoulders. He was pulled under. The darkness of the deep bog swallowed him. He thrashed violently, kicking his heavy boots, trying to draw his short knife, but his arms were pinned to his sides by an unbreakable cage of dead, leathery limbs. He was sinking fast. 10 feet, 20 feet. The water here was not liquid. It was a thick, viscous slurry of decaying plant matter and ancient silt. It pressed against his eyes, his ears, trying to force its way into his nose and mouth. His lungs burned with the agonizing, desperate need for oxygen. He was drowning in the dark, dragged down to join the eternal chorus of the mire. His vision began to fade into a peaceful, euphoric blackness. The fight was leaving his body. The mother had lost her tree, but the bog was still claiming its prize. 40 feet down. Suddenly, the pressure changed. Einar felt the thick, suffocating mud beneath him give way. It wasn't a gradual thinning, it was an abrupt, catastrophic structural failure. The massive explosion above had not just shattered the flesh tree, it had fractured the thick, ancient crust of compressed peat that formed the floor of the shallow bog. With a deafening, underwater crack, the peat bed shattered like rotten ice. Einar, still entangled with half a dozen leathery corpses, fell through the bottom of the bog. He didn't hit solid earth. He fell through empty air. Gravity reasserted its brutal hold. Einar and the corpses plummeted through the pitch-black void, accompanied by a massive waterfall of foul black mud and stagnant water pouring through the fractured ceiling above them. He fell for what felt like an eternity, the rushing wind deafening him, spinning wildly in the dark. He slammed into something hard, wet, and yielding. The impact knocked the remaining air from his lungs, but the angle of his fall saved his life. He had hit a steep, slick slope. He slid uncontrollably, tumbling head over heels in the absolute blackness, until he finally rolled to a stop on a relatively flat, damp surface. He lay there, gasping, retching up the foul bog water he had swallowed, his body screaming in agony. He was not underwater. He was breathing air, stale, damp, freezing air, but it was air. He forced his eyes open. Absolute, impenetrable darkness. Not a sliver of light from the burning bog above penetrated this deep. He pushed himself up onto his hands and knees. The surface beneath him was not stone, it was wood. Massive, thick, twisting wood, slick with black slime. He was sitting on a root, but not the roots of the flesh tree. These roots were colossal, ancient, thick as the walls of a fortress. However, Einar rasped, his voice echoing endlessly in a cavernous, vast space. "Runa?" he heard coughing, groans of pain echoing from the darkness nearby. Some of his men had survived the fall. Einar fumbled for his pouch. Miraculously, his flint and steel were still there, though soaking wet. He found a small piece of dry tinder tucked deep inside a waterproof oilcloth. With shaking, bleeding hands, he struck a spark. It caught. He blew gently, coaxing a tiny, fragile yellow flame to life. He held the small burning tinder up. The weak light illuminated only a fraction of their new reality, but it was enough to stop Einar's heart. They had fallen through the crust of the bog into a subterranean cavern of unimaginable size. The ceiling, far above them, was a tangled, dripping mass of black peat and roots. But they were not sitting on the floor of a cave. They were sitting on the branches of an actual tree, a primordial, petrified world tree, buried completely beneath the earth, its canopy holding up the entire black mire. Einar looked down over the edge of the massive branch he was sitting on. The weak light of his tinder didn't reach the bottom. It was an infinite drop into a misty, echoing abyss. And from that abyss, a sound drifted up. It wasn't the singing of the Bog Bodies. It was the sound of something unimaginably massive moving through the dark. The sound of ancient, petrified wood creaking and snapping as something began to climb up the world tree toward them. They hadn't escaped the mother of the mire. They had just fallen into her basement. "Put the light out, Jarl," Halvor whispered from the darkness nearby. His voice was filled with a cosmic, soul-crushing dread. "Put it out now, it sees us." Einar crushed the fragile, burning tinder between his heavily calloused, bleeding fingers. The tiny flame died instantly. Absolute, suffocating blackness crashed back down upon them like a physical weight. In the dark, deprived of sight, the other senses became agonizingly sharp. The smell was the first thing that overwhelmed them. Not just the sulfur and methane of the surface bog, but the dry, ancient scent of petrified wood, stagnant dust, and the overpowering metallic reek of dried blood that had been buried for eons. And then there was the sound. Crake. Snap. It was a slow, rhythmic noise echoing up from the unfathomable abyss beneath their boots. It sounded like the hull of a massive longship being crushed by a kraken, but multiplied 100-fold. It was the sound of colossal weight shifting against ancient, petrified wood. Something impossibly large was pulling itself up the trunk of the subterranean world tree. "Do not move," Einar whispered, his voice trembling so violently he barely recognized it as his own. "Do not breathe loudly. It hunts by vibration." "Garl," Runa's voice came from a few feet away, a terrified, ragged gasp in the pitch black. "Where are we? What is this place?" "We are under the mud," Halvor rasped. Einar heard the old veteran shifting slightly on the massive branch. "The mire is just a roof, a crust of dead things. We have fallen into the cellar of the gods." Einar carefully lowered himself until he was lying flat on his stomach against the enormous branch. The wood beneath him was slick with a layer of cold, gelatinous slime, but it was solid. He reached his arms out, trying to gauge the width of the branch. He couldn't feel the edges. It was wider than the king's great hall in Kattegat. Snap! Crunch! The sound was getting closer. The vibrations were now traveling up the trunk and into the branch they were lying on, rattling Einar's teeth in his skull. "Einar!" a voice cried out from the darkness, further out on the branch. It was young Torf. No, Torf had been absorbed by the flesh tree. It was another warrior, a man named Skuli. "My leg is broken. I can't feel my leg. Help me. Skuli, be quiet," Einar hissed into the void. "But panic is a wildfire in the dark." Skuli began to sob loudly, thrashing against the wood, the sound of his iron chainmail scraping violently against the petrified bark. The rhythmic climbing sound from below abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was the most terrifying thing Einar had ever experienced. The entity had paused. It was listening. "Skuli, I order you to stop moving," Einar whispered, drawing his short sakes, the only weapon he hadn't lost in the fall. Skuli didn't stop. He dragged himself across the branch, whimpering in pain, his heavy boots thudding against the wood. From the abyss below, a new sound erupted. It was a massive, wet inhalation, as if a cavernous lung was drawing in all the dead air of the underworld. And then it struck. It didn't climb the rest of the way. It lunged. Einar felt the massive branch beneath him buckle and dip under an incomprehensible weight. A horrific, roaring hiss filled the cavern, a sound composed of thousands of human voices screaming in unison. A sudden, violent gust of wind, carrying the stench of an open mass grave, washed over Einar. Skuli's sobbing was cut short by a sickening, wet crunch. It was the sound of a man in full iron armor being bitten perfectly in half. Warm, sticky rain showered over Einar in the dark, It took his paralyzed mind a second to realize it was Schooley's blood. "It has him," Runa wept silently, the sound barely reaching Anna's ears over the wet, tearing noises of the creature feeding just 30 feet away on the same branch. "Look up," Halvor whispered softly. Anna rolled onto his back and opened his eyes. Far above them, perhaps 300 feet up in the cavernous dark, there was a jagged, irregular opening. It was the hole they had fallen through. And through that hole, Einar could see a faint, flickering orange glow. The surface of the black mire was still burning from his gas explosion. It was a beacon, the only way out of the underworld. "We have to climb," Einar whispered back. "The roots overhead, they connect to the crust." "The beast is between us and the trunk," Halvor said. The veteran's voice was terrifyingly calm. It was the voice of a man who knew his saga was ending. "And I cannot climb, Jarl. My spine is shattered. I cannot move my legs." Einar's heart sank. He reached out in the dark and found Halvor's hand. The old warrior's grip was surprisingly strong. "I will carry you," Einar said, though he knew it was a lie. He was exhausted, battered, and unarmed save for a dagger. "You will carry the story, Jarl," Halvor replied, squeezing Einar's hand. "A Viking does not die in the dark, waiting to be eaten like a blind worm. He dies in the light of his own making." The feeding sounds nearby stopped. A low, vibrating growl shook the branch. The entity had finished its appetizer. Now, it was looking for the rest of the meat. In the pitch blackness, a faint, sickly pale green light began to emanate from the creature. It was bioluminescent fungi growing along the massive scales of the beast. As the dose slowly intensified, the true, apocalyptic scale of the monster was revealed. It was a Wyrm, a dragon of the deep earth. But it was not made of scales and fire. It was a colossal, serpentine amalgamation of ancient, petrified wood, black peat, and bones. Thousands of human skulls and rib cages were woven into its thick, rotting hide, forming a macabre, rattling armor. Its head was a massive, blunt, battering ram of solid bog iron and fossilized mammoth tusks. It had no eyes. Only a gaping, circular maw filled with rows of jagged, broken swords and spears that it had consumed over the centuries, the weapons of fallen warriors acting as its teeth. It was Nidhogg, Dag's and Nidhogger's starved, rotting cousin, the corpse worm of the Black Mire. Its massive head swung slowly toward Einar, Runa, and Halvor, its jaw opening to release a cloud of toxic yellow gas. "Runa, Einar," Halvor said, his voice ringing out loud and clear in the cavern. "When the flash comes, you run for the trunk. You climb the hanging roots. Do not look back." "Halvor, no!" Einar yelled. But Halvor had already reached into his own soaked pouch. He pulled out his flint and a heavy piece of steel. The corpse worm roared, a sound that threatened to burst their eardrums, and lunged forward, its massive jaws opening wide enough to swallow a longship. Halvor struck the flint. The spark caught the ambient marsh breath venting from the creature's own gaping maw. The resulting explosion was blinding. A sphere of bright blue and orange fire erupted directly in the worm's face, illuminating the entire subterranean cavern for a brilliant, terrifying second. Einar saw the colossal trunk of the petrified world tree. He saw a thick lattice of smaller roots hanging down from the glowing hole in the ceiling, 100 feet away. "Go!" Halvor screamed, his beard catching fire as the worm recoiled in shock, thrashing blindly against the burning gas. Einar grabbed Runa's hand and ran. They sprinted across the massive, slick branch, their boots slipping on the ancient wood. Behind them, the worm recovered from the blast instantly. It let out a furious, deafening shriek and slammed its massive tusked head down, exactly where Halvor lay. The branch shuddered violently. Halvor was gone, crushed into the petrified wood, but his sacrifice had bought them 10 seconds of life. Einar and Runa reached the massive trunk of the subterranean tree. Thick, hairy roots, some as wide as a man's torso, hung down from the fractured ceiling far above, dangling into the abyss. "Climb!" Einar roared, shoving Runa toward a cluster of thick roots. She jumped, grabbing the rough, muddy vines, and began to pull herself up with frantic, adrenaline-fueled strength. Einar jumped a second later, grabbing a parallel root, his burned hand screaming in agony as the rough bark tore his skin open again. They climbed like spiders, hauling their exhausted bodies upward into the dark, aiming for the faint orange glow of the hole above. 30 feet up, 50 feet. Below them, the corpse worm realized its prey was escaping. The beast slammed its massive body against the trunk of the world tree. The impact was like an earthquake. Einar nearly lost his grip, swinging wildly in the empty air, suspended over the bottomless abyss. "Keep climbing!" Einar yelled to Runa, who was 10 feet above him. The worm began to ascend. It didn't climb like a snake. It dug its massive fossilized tusks and the broken swords in its maw directly into the petrified wood of the trunk, hauling its colossal bulk upward with terrifying speed. Crunch, crunch, crunch! The sound of the beast tearing into the wood echoed right beneath Einar's boots. The smell of ancient rot and sulfur washed over him, making him gag. He looked down. The glowing, fungal-covered head of the worm was barely 40 feet below him, its circular maw snapping wildly, trying to reach the dangling Vikings. "It's too fast!" Runa cried out, her strength finally failing. She slipped, sliding down a few feet before catching herself on a knot in the root. "Einar, I can't. Look at the light!" Einar roared, pushing through a barrier of pain he didn't know existed. "We are almost there. 50 feet. The orange glow was bright now, casting dancing shadows over the dangling roots. The heat of the burning bog above was radiating down into the shaft, fighting the ancient cold of the cavern. The worm lunged upward, its jaws snapping shut, just inches below Einar's boots. The force of the snap sent a gust of foul wind up his legs. It was going to get them. They could not outclimb a beast of the earth. Einar looked up at the fractured hole. The edges of the crust were glowing red-hot from the fire above. Massive chunks of burning peat and boiling mud were dangerously close to falling into the hole. An idea, born of pure desperate madness, formed in Einar's mind. "Runa, climb faster. Do not stop until you are out," Einar yelled. He stopped climbing. He wrapped his legs tightly around the thick root, securing himself. He drew his short, heavy seeks. "What are you doing?" Runa screamed, looking down at him. Buying time," Einar answered. He didn't look down at the beast. He looked up at the burning crust of the bog, perfectly aligned above the dangling roots. With a roar that rivaled the monster below, Einar threw his heavy iron sayak straight up, aiming for the glowing, fractured edge of the ceiling. The blade spun through the air. It struck the weakened, burning peat crust with a solid thunk. The fragile equilibrium of the fractured roof failed. A massive section of the ceiling, a chunk of burning peat and boiling black mud, the size of a wagon, broke loose. It plummeted downward, a flaming meteor of ancient earth, falling directly toward Einar. "Einar!" Runa shrieked. Einar swung his body violently to the side, letting go of the main root and grabbing a smaller, secondary vine just as the burning mass of mud and fire roared past him. The heat scorched his face, singeing his eyebrows. The flaming meteor fell straight down the shaft. The corpse worm, looking up with its gaping circular maw, took the full force of the impact directly down its throat. Tons of boiling, burning black mud and fire exploded inside the beast's mouth. The worm let out a shriek that was so loud it cracked the petrified wood around them. The creature thrashed violently in pure agony, its massive body whipping away from the trunk. It lost its grip on the wood. The colossal, rotting dragon fell backward into the abyss, twisting and screaming as it plummeted into the unfathomable depths, its pale green glow shrinking until it vanished completely into the dark. Einar hung from the vine, panting, his chest heaving. He listened until the shrieks of the beast faded into nothingness. Einar! Runa's voice came from above. She was reaching her hand down through the glowing hole. "Come on, take my hand." Einar swung back to the main route. He climbed the last 30 feet, his muscles screaming, his vision blurring. He reached the edge of the fractured crust. Runa grabbed his collar and hauled him over the edge, out of the underworld. They collapsed onto the surface of the black mire. It was a vision of hell. The fog was entirely gone, burned away by the massive fire Einar had started. The entire bog was ablaze. Flames danced across the pools of black water, feeding on the ancient gases. The air was thick with black smoke and falling ash. The screaming faces of the bog bodies in the shallows were illuminated by the horrific orange light, their leathery skin bubbling in the heat. But it was the surface. The sky above, obscured by smoke, was beginning to turn a pale, bruised purple. Dawn was breaking. Einar and Runa lay on their backs in the shallow, warm mud, coughing violently, their bodies utterly broken, but alive. Out of 30 warriors, only 2 had returned from the rot. A sound echoed across the burning wasteland. It was a horn, a Saxon horn. Einar forced his heavy head up through the smoke and flames. On the distant, solid edge of the tree line, he saw them, the Saxon army. 300 mounted men. They had caught up. Einar looked at Runa. She had lost her sword. Her face was a mask of dirt, blood, and burns. She looked back at him, a hollow, empty stare. "Let them come," Einar whispered, too exhausted to even stand. But the Saxons did not charge. The enemy commander rode his horse to the very edge of the black mire. He looked at the massive, raging inferno that spanned the horizon. He looked at the boiling black water and the thousands of screaming, leathery faces floating in the shallows, illuminated by the hellfire. He saw Einar and Runa, 2 mud-caked, bloody survivors, lying in the center of the apocalypse, looking less like humans and more like demons born of the fire. The Saxon commander's horse reared back, screaming in terror at the stench of burning flesh and sulfur. The commander lowered his horn. He made the sign of the cross over his chest, his face pale with absolute dread. He turned his horse around and spurted back into the forest, fleeing from a place clearly abandoned by God. The Saxon army broke and fled, retreating into the dawn. They were gone. Einar let his head fall back into the black mud. He stared up at the smoke-filled sky as the first true rays of the morning sun pierced the gloom, casting a weak golden light over the burning wasteland. He had survived the Saxon steel. He had survived the mother of the mire. He had survived the mother of the mire. He had survived the corpse Wyrm in the dark. But as he lay there, feeling the warm black peat pressing against his back, Einar knew the truth. The Viking who had walked into the fog was dead. The Jarl of the Great Hall was dead. He raised his hand, looking at his burned, mud-stained fingers. The dirt was under his nails. The sulfur was in his lungs. The whispers of the dead were permanently etched into his mind. The earth had not eaten him, but it had claimed him all the same. "We are the Bog now, Runa," Einar whispered into the crackling fire, closing his eyes to finally rest. "We are the Bog."